On the 5th day of January in 1942, as triumphant cries of victory echoed throughout the capital of Japan, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto directed the staff officers of the Imperial Combined Fleet to commence preparations for the second phase of operations in the Pacific conflict. His analysis of the situation reports concerning the Philippines, Malaya, and the southern regions indicated that Japanese military forces, within a matter of months, would establish complete dominion over East Asia and the additional territories they had assaulted in December. Consequently, Yamamoto informed his chief of staff, Motome Ugaki, that he required the operational plans to be finalized by the middle of February. The astonishing rapidity with which Japanese forces had overrun the Western Pacific stunned the strategic planners in Tokyo and provoked intense disagreement within the Imperial General Staff. The fervent military nationalists advocated for pressing the offensive for as long as Japan continued to achieve victory, irrespective of how far such strategic planning might lead them. A separate faction, represented by Admiral Yamamoto, had been far less enthusiastic about initiating hostilities with the United States and Great Britain and expressed profound concern regarding the future. One reason Yamamoto was stationed at sea aboard the Combined Fleet flagship, Yamato, was that his associates within the Imperial General Staff feared he would be assassinated if he remained in Tokyo due to his public opposition to a war of unlimited scope. Even at this juncture, his dissenting opinions were no secret to those in his immediate circle. His chief of staff, Admiral Ugaki, wrote in his personal diary regarding the imperative for visionary statesmanship following this initial month of glorious triumph. These were sentiments Yamamoto frequently employed, cautioning that Japan could not realistically expect to prevail in a prolonged war against the Western powers. Yamamoto's open censure of the political leadership was aimed at figures such as Prince Fumimaro Konoe and others who appeared not to comprehend the nature of the war Japan ought to be waging in the Pacific. 3 months prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto had met with an old acquaintance, Ryoichi Sasakawa, the president of the ultra-nationalist Kokusui Kai organization, at the Imperial Navy Club in Shiba. Yamamoto, warning his friend that war was now inevitable due to decisions taken by the political leaders, stated that initially Japanese forces would have everything their own way, stretching out like an octopus spreading its tentacles. And now, merely a month after the war had commenced, the octopus was indeed spread almost flat across the map. However, Yamamoto had also cautioned his old friend that this state of euphoria could not endure indefinitely. The opportune moment for political action, he declared, would be the instant Singapore fell. That impending disaster would deeply unsettle the British in India, and they would undoubtedly become receptive to negotiations for peace. Yamamoto possessed an intimate understanding of the British, having served as a member of the Japanese delegations to the London Naval Conferences of 1930 and 1934. He was also deeply familiar with the Americans, having held the post of Japanese naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1928. He concurred that once the politicians had initiated a war, a major and decisive victory needed to be secured swiftly. Yet once that victory was achieved, he believed Japan would have only about 18 months to bask in its glory. "We must secure a peace agreement by then," he told Sasakawa. And he looked to this old comrade to convey this message among the right-wing political leaders then in power. By January 5th, this decisive victory seemed imminent. The American battleship fleet had been neutralized at Pearl Harbor on December 7th. The British battleships, Repulse and Prince of Wales, had been sent to the bottom off the coast of Malaya. In the Philippines, the capital city of Manila and the significant U.S. naval base at Cavite had been captured. British forces had surrendered at Hong Kong, and Japanese units were advancing toward new landings in the Dutch East Indies, at Rabaul on New Ireland, Kamba, and in the Solomon Islands. Nevertheless, the attack on Pearl Harbor had failed to accomplish the totality of Yamamoto's objectives. The major elements of the United States fleet, its aircraft carriers, had been at sea and remained unharmed, thus constituting a perpetual threat. What was now required was a spectacular, war-altering achievement, and Yamamoto did not anticipate the fall of Singapore for another 5 or 6 months. It ultimately occurred on February 15th. He believed that to realize his goal of establishing a foundation for negotiation, he must strike in a different direction. The critical question facing his planners was where to direct the next blow. The Imperial Japanese Army vetoed Yamamoto's suggestion for an assault on the Soviet Union, as such a conflict would be fought predominantly on land, and the army was already heavily committed in China and Southeast Asia. Consequently, 3 alternative concepts were proposed. Yamamoto's preferred option was to launch an offensive into the Indian Ocean, invade Ceylon, lure out the British Far Eastern Fleet, and annihilate it, just as Yamamoto had devastated the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. Following this, the Japanese Navy could push into the Middle East to link up with German forces driving toward the Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus, thereby securing all the oil the Japanese Navy would require. The Army refused to contemplate a Middle Eastern operation, leaving only 2 remaining plans. One, championed by the Naval General Staff in Tokyo, called for an attack on Australia to deprive the Americans of that crucial forward base. After advancing into the Solomon Islands, the Navy would seize New Guinea, New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa. Proponents of this strategy at Imperial General Headquarters were already establishing administrative systems for the occupation of Australia and New Zealand. However, Yamamoto disapproved of the Australia plan, believing it would be too protracted and still insufficiently spectacular to halt the American war effort. Yamamoto also understood that the Pearl Harbor attack had ignited a powerful spirit of vengeance among the American people, a nation the Japanese had been taught to disdain as soft and incompetent. Too soft, the Army contended, to fight a war to its ultimate conclusion. It was apparent that even the capture of Singapore would not deter the Americans. Yamamoto sought a victory so stunning it would enable Japan to extend a generous olive branch from a position of strength. In January, Yamamoto ordered the drafting of another plan, and 2 months later dispatched officers to Tokyo with a document designated the MI Operation, which envisioned a decisive battle off Midway Island where the American carrier force would be utterly destroyed. He also submitted the AL Operation, detailing an invasion of the North American continent via the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. If all proceeded favorably, Hawaii could be occupied, and later, perhaps, even the west coast of the United States. At a minimum, victories at Midway and in the Aleutians would furnish the politicians with a powerful foundation for negotiating the kind of peace settlement Yamamoto hoped to achieve. In Tokyo, the admirals engaged in heated debate around the conference table in the Navy Ministry, but ultimately Yamamoto prevailed. Forgotten was the potential strategic significance of Singapore's fall in February and the impending collapse of Bataan and Corregidor, either of which might have served Yamamoto's diplomatic purpose. The reason these events were no longer deemed sufficient lay in the April raid on Tokyo by Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle's squadron of B-25 bombers. The Doolittle raid shocked the Japanese nation into a stark realization that the Americans were only just beginning to fight. In June, after the Midway operation erupted into a catastrophic disaster for Japan, there was no time for recriminations. Indeed, the Japanese army was not even informed of the full extent of the defeat. The news of the destruction of 4 front-line fleet carriers was meticulously suppressed, known only at the most senior echelons of the Navy. While Yamamoto had been engaged in his Midway endeavor, the Naval General Staff in Tokyo had been steadily pushing the Navy and its air forces southward to prepare for the forthcoming attempt to sever Australia's supply lines. Naval units had captured Rabaul on January 23rd, and from that point onward, they conducted continuous aerial reconnaissance and bombing raids against other islands and New Guinea. It became apparent to the Australians, who communicated their grave concerns to General Douglas MacArthur following his arrival in March, that the Japanese would soon move against New Guinea. If they were successful, it would be a relatively straightforward operation for the Japanese to seize northern Australia. In February, the Japanese had already bombed Darwin, and in March, when they invaded Salamaua in New Guinea, the pace of their advance accelerated. In May, just prior to the Battle of Midway, the Japanese dispatched an occupation force toward Port Moresby, but it was repulsed by the determined defense of American and Australian forces in the carrier battle of the Coral Sea. The Japanese did succeed in occupying Tulagi, north of Guadalcanal, and constructed a seaplane base there. The Battle of the Coral Sea convinced planners in both Washington and Australia that they had to prepare for a major Japanese offensive in the South Pacific. MacArthur informed the Australian government that it must be ready for an assault, which he considered a more immediate threat than a widely anticipated Japanese thrust against India. He cabled General George Marshall, requesting 2 aircraft carriers and 1,000 planes. However, in Washington that May, Admiral Ernest J. King, the Chief of Naval Operations, informed General Marshall that until the end of June, he would have only 2 operational carriers in the entire Pacific Ocean. On the eve of Midway, the Japanese possessed 10, while Pacific Fleet Commander Admiral Chester W. Nimitz had already issued an advanced warning regarding the major Japanese move he anticipated, which ultimately materialized as the Midway operation. While these pivotal events were unfolding at Midway, the Japanese were consolidating their forces in the New Guinea Solomons region. Major General Tomitaro Hori's South Seas Force landed at Salamaua, and naval troops occupied Lae, commencing the construction of an airbase there. Independently of Admiral Yamamoto, the Imperial General Staff had planned the Port Moresby operation, and Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake was ordered to press on toward New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa, and to be prepared to resume the advance against Port Moresby by July. This would occur after the Midway battle, when Admiral Yamamoto was expected to return with his combined fleet. That powerful carrier force was anticipated to provide protection for this new southward move. Despite the catastrophic defeat at Midway, which was publicly reported as a victory to the forces in the field, Imperial General Headquarters did not alter its fundamental plans. A few days after Midway, the Australians informed General MacArthur that the Japanese were preparing to move. In light of the reported victory at Midway, MacArthur proposed that the Allies launch a preemptive attack on the New Britain-New Ireland area, followed by an assault on Rabaul, the principal Japanese naval and air base in the region. With the 2 carriers, the 1,000 planes, and an amphibious division, MacArthur asserted he could force the Japanese back to truck. On June 12th, General Marshall presented MacArthur's plan to Admiral King with some modifications. He requested 3 carriers instead of 2, plus 1 Marine division and 3 Army divisions to execute the assaults. Admiral King opposed the concept primarily because it would place MacArthur in command of the naval-centric fighting. King's supplementary reasons were tactical. The carriers would be vulnerable to land-based air attack and would lack sufficient protective screens. As events would later prove, the U.S. Navy had to contend with both of these very problems at Guadalcanal. King formulated his own plan, a drive northward from the New Hebrides by forces under Navy command. MacArthur objected to having his Army forces serve under naval authority, but no one could deny the absolute necessity of halting the Japanese before they secured New Guinea and positioned themselves to attack Australia. The dilemma for the Joint Chiefs of Staff was determining who would command the operation. They assigned Phase 1, the primary task of seizing the Santa Cruz Islands, Tulagi, and adjacent positions, to Admiral King. Guadalcanal was, at this stage, merely a spot on the map with no widely recognized tactical or strategic value. It did not even merit a specific mention in this initial JCS plan. To General MacArthur, they threw a sup after Phase 1. He was to assume command and mop up the remaining Japanese forces in the rest of the Solomons, Rabaul, and New Guinea. Admiral King had his way because the Joint Chiefs recognized that King had already established a defensive line across the Pacific to protect Australia, and his plan would require relatively less force than MacArthur's more ambitious proposal. Thousands of American troops were training in New Caledonia, and King had persuaded General Henry Hap Arnold to dispatch several squadrons of United States Army Air Force planes there. He had reinforced Samoa and Efate in the New Hebrides and planned to establish a base at Tonga. Admiral Wilson Brown, whose indecisiveness during the Wake Island crisis had drawn King's ire, was reassigned to a newly established unit called the Amphibious Training Command at San Diego. He and Marine Major General Holland Howlin' Mad Smith were instructed to develop innovative techniques for island warfare. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, King's chief plans officer, suggested that the initial effort must be to hold the line in the South Pacific while simultaneously training the amphibious forces. The second stage would involve a combined offensive by the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, advancing through the Solomon Islands to the Bismarck Archipelago and the Admiralty Islands. The third stage would entail the seizure of the Caroline and Marshall Islands, and the fourth stage would see the Allies advance either to the Dutch East Indies or to the Philippines. Admiral King approved this strategic outline. It aligned perfectly with his own vision, and he made arrangements to bring Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley, who was serving as a naval observer in London, back to head the South Pacific Command. King detached Rear Admiral Turner from the Plans Division and instructed him to prepare to take command of the amphibious operations. All these preparations were underway even before the Japanese assault on Port Moresby and Tulagi. Vice Admiral Gormley departed Washington on May 1st. He was scheduled to assume command of the South Pacific Force on June 19th. But first he had to report to Admiral Nimitz at Pearl Harbor, who would be his direct superior. By the time Gormley reached Pearl Harbor, the Japanese offensive in the South Pacific was already commencing. On May 22nd, an Allied Army plane observed a Japanese photo-reconnaissance aircraft taking pictures of Guadalcanal. Army intelligence suggested the Japanese were preparing to construct an airfield there. On June 25th, Army intelligence reported that the grass on the island's central plain had been burned off and tents had been erected in the area. A wharf was under construction at Lunga Point. 6 days later, an Australian coast watcher on Guadalcanal reported that the construction of an airfield was imminent, awaiting only the arrival of specialized Japanese construction units. He even identified the units by name, the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces, which were the Japanese equivalent of American CB units. This intelligence was corroborated by a radio interception made by Nimitz's intelligence officers at Pearl Harbor. The Pacific Fleet's Radio Intelligence Group, which had partially broken the Japanese naval code, intercepted a message indicating that the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces would arrive at their destination on July 4th. Fleet intelligence connected the dots. Admiral Turner happened to be visiting Pearl Harbor that day, en route to prepare for an amphibious landing somewhere in the South Pacific. When Admiral Nimitz received the radio intelligence report, Admiral Turner knew his destination. It could be nowhere else but the Solomon Islands. Within 2 weeks, Turner was in Wellington, New Zealand, where he boarded his flagship, the USS Macaulay, the former Grace Line passenger ship Santa Barbara. His formidable task was to train an entire amphibious task force within a single month. As Turner began orchestrating the movement of ships and men, Admiral Gormley was en route to Melbourne to confer with General MacArthur. Gormley left New Zealand filled with pessimistic thoughts about the folly of attempting such a complex amphibious operation when no one truly knew how to execute it properly. MacArthur, who had his own reasons for disliking the plan, concurred entirely. They also agreed that, given the limited number of aircraft available, they could not guarantee adequate air cover for the landings. This meeting took place on July 18th, and the landings were scheduled to occur in just 3 weeks. Gormley dispatched a message back to Washington, strongly recommending that the operation be postponed. Admiral King, however, was not pleased with this recommendation. He had previously informed his new commander that he was handing him a difficult assignment and that he might not be able to provide all the necessary resources until perhaps the fall. His answer was an unequivocal no. The invasion would proceed as planned. Gormley had left Washington already convinced that the United States was not prepared for aggressive action in the South Pacific. His gloom deepened when his attempts to secure immediate shipment of construction battalions and other essential units to New Zealand failed. From the outset, the Guadalcanal invasion plan was plagued by intelligence failures. All concerned commands were aware that an operation was imminent, particularly after July 10th, when Admiral Nimitz issued his operations orders to Admiral Gormley. The major Japanese airbase was known to be at Rabaul. Planes from those fields could theoretically stage through Guadalcanal, refuel, and then bomb Australia. There was no doubt they could strike a devastating blow against the Allied buildup. Yet, on July 10th, an Allied intelligence services report reaching King contained only a casual remark about airfield construction on Guadalcanal. And a few days later, another report erroneously located the field on the wrong side of the island. By the end of July, the Japanese had completed the airfield. Back at Combined Fleet headquarters in Japan, Admiral Yamamoto issued orders that the first staged mission from this new field would depart Rabaul on August 14th. If American intelligence had been faulty in permitting the Japanese buildup of the airfield on Guadalcanal, Japanese intelligence was even more deficient. As the massive United States invasion fleet assembled in the South Pacific, the Japanese High Command had no inkling of an impending attack. In July 1942, the Japanese Army was primarily preoccupied with its efforts to capture New Guinea as a staging area for operations against Australia and New Zealand. Major General Tomitaro Hori's South Seas Force had landed 2,000 troops near Buna. After securing Buna, the Japanese planned to construct airfields there as a prelude to a renewed assault on Port Moresby. Consequently, in July, Japanese air power was concentrated against Port Moresby. Bombers and fighters swept over the piers and airfields nearly every day. Following the Japanese landings, their air forces were also tasked with supporting the beachhead. In the early days of August, their attention remained fixed on this new drive. The combined Australian and American air forces responded with raids on Japanese air bases at Lae. During these preparations, Admiral Yamamoto's flagship, Yamato, was anchored at Hashirajima in Japanese home waters. In a leisurely manner, he was preparing for forthcoming air operations over Australia, intending to assess what subsequent actions would be necessary. In preparation for these operations, on August 3rd, the naval air groups stationed at Lae were recalled to Rabaul to be ready for the Guadalcanal operation scheduled to begin the following week. During the first week of August, the skies over the South Pacific were heavily overcast, and only a handful of Japanese search planes took to the air. None of them discovered the enormous American armada steaming toward Guadalcanal. Japanese airmen flying out of Rabaul were surprised to encounter American carrier aircraft in the skies around Buna. They had been told that the U.S. carriers were destroyed at Midway. The pilots assumed these must be aircraft operating with Australian forces that had marched across the Owen Stanley Mountains. In reality, they were American planes training for the Guadalcanal invasion. No one in the Imperial High Command or in the field suspected an imminent invasion. After 8 months of continuous, stunning victories, it was difficult for the Japanese to conceive that the Allies possessed the capability to launch a major seaborne invasion. Had the idea been suggested, they likely would have agreed with General MacArthur and Admiral Gormley that such an undertaking had almost no chance of success. Thus, as the American Expeditionary Force advanced toward Guadalcanal, it enjoyed the priceless element of surprise. On August 4th and 5th, the 75-ship fleet steamed on beneath an overcast sky. On August 6th, the fleet moved through persistent rain squalls for almost the entire day. But as dawn broke on the morning of August 7th, the sky cleared, granting the carrier pilots excellent visibility for their attacks. The fleet went to general quarters at 5:30 a.m., and at 6 a.m., the carriers launched their first strike. Aircraft from the USS Wasp, USS Saratoga, and USS Enterprise were assigned targets on Guadalcanal itself, as well as on the small islands of Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo. The Japanese had established a seaplane base on Gavutu and Tanambogo, which were connected by a causeway. Japanese aircraft had been largely grounded the previous day due to the adverse weather. Admiral Fletcher's task force reported sighting one unidentified aircraft during the day, but it remained unclear whether it was Japanese or belonged to General MacArthur's command. In any event, the Japanese garrison was not fully alerted until 6:12 a.m., when the communications headquarters at the Tulagi seaplane base transmitted a frantic message announcing the attack. The radio signal was sent to the 4th, 6th, and 8th Fleets, to Admiral Yamamoto, and to Imperial headquarters. It was succinct and dire. Enemy heavy bombardment in progress. The weather had cleared, and the carrier planes flew off into a sky dotted with scattered cumulus clouds, illuminated by the faint light of a quarter moon. The fighters and bombers proceeded toward their designated objectives. 8 fighters led by Lieutenant L.H. Bauer took off from the Enterprise to attack Guadalcanal, targeting potential aircraft, PT boats, troop installations, and supply dumps. They found no aircraft and no PT boats, but they did strafe the buildings clustered around the airfield at Lunga Point. Meanwhile, another 8 fighters from the Enterprise maintained a combat air patrol, CAP, over the transport area from 6 a.m. until 8 a.m., when they were relieved by other aircraft. Bombers began to strike Tulagi and the Lunga Point area, but no enemy air activity was observed throughout the entire morning. The Americans enjoyed complete air superiority, and the only planes damaged were those lost in operational accidents. Aircraft from the other carriers attacked the seaplane base at Gavutu. The surprise was total. American planes arrived and immediately commenced bombing and strafing the seaplanes moored in the water. They destroyed 9 float planes, similar to the Zero, 1 4-engine Kawanishi flying boat, and 8 other seaplanes that served dual roles as search planes and bombers. The few Japanese pilots who attempted to take off were shot down before they could become airborne. Not a single Japanese plane at Gavutu survived the assault, Other carrier planes hit Japanese troop concentrations on Tulagi. Some struck targets on the beaches that the Marines were scheduled to invade. Before dawn, the Marines standing on the decks of the transports could see the high, dark mountains of the island that was their objective. The transport slipped through the narrow passage between Guadalcanal and Savo Island into what would become known as Sea Lark Channel. As dawn rose, the guns of the escorting warships opened fire, their flashes illuminating the fleet in the pre-dawn gloom. There was virtually no answering fire from the shore. The bombardment from the accompanying cruisers and destroyers started fires along the coastline. An oil dump exploded, sending flames leaping high into the sky. At 8 a.m., after 2 hours of sustained bombing and naval shelling of the island, the landing craft began moving toward the northern shore, east of Lunga Point. The Marines were tense. Neither they nor their officers possessed any practical experience in an amphibious landing, for this was the first American assault of its kind since the Spanish-American War. At 9 a.m., troops began landing on Guadalcanal. They encountered no resistance because the Japanese construction troops and naval guards had fled into the surrounding hills. The initial advance was ridiculously easy. The Marines quickly grasped the completeness of their surprise. They came across wooden barracks that appeared never to have been slept in. They found a tent with a breakfast table still laden with platters and bowls of meat, rice, and cooked plums. Half-filled rice bowls were scattered about, with chopsticks hastily dropped on the table or on the straw mats covering the floor. The tents themselves revealed why the Japanese had fled so rapidly. They were torn by shrapnel, and some had been flattened by the pre-landing naval bombardment. Yet, any Marine who felt inclined to celebrate the ease of their early objectives was in for a severe shock. It was true the Japanese had been caught by surprise on Guadalcanal and had not yet established permanent fortifications or deeply dug in, largely because most of the men present were construction personnel, not frontline combat troops. But over on Tulagi, Lieutenant Colonel Merritt A. Red Mike, Edson's 1st Marine Raider Battalion and the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines encountered stiff resistance from the outset. Approximately 250 Japanese troops, members of the Yokohama Air Base Detachment under Captain Shikayama, were stationed on Tulagi. These were experienced and dedicated fighters. Edson's 1st Raiders represented the toughest American troops in the Pacific at that time. They were all volunteers, selected from the ranks of a force already renowned for its fighting qualities. The Raider concept had been proposed by Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson, who recommended creating a commando-style force based partly on his experiences serving for several months with the Chinese Communist 8th Route Army in its guerrilla campaigns against the Japanese in North China. Edson's Raiders had trained for many months under Spartan conditions, and by the time they reached Guadalcanal, they possessed a formidable reputation. As events would prove, they would need every bit of their training and would learn new brutal lessons in combat. This invasion marked the first direct confrontation between highly trained American troops and seasoned Japanese veterans since the war began in December. The Japanese had cultivated a reputation even more fearsome than that of the Raider battalions, achieved through their phenomenally rapid conquests in the Philippines, Malaya, and the East Indies. For months, Tokyo had boasted of these victories, and half the world had come to believe the Japanese were invincible, a reputation the Imperial High Command was pleased to encourage. Tulagi therefore became the first true testing ground. Edson's troops landed at 8:15 a.m. on the northwestern part of Tulagi. Initially, the opposition seemed only marginally tougher than on Guadalcanal. They encountered sporadic resistance from a few outposts. The northwestern part of Tulagi was covered in thick jungle, small trees, vines, and bougainvillea with its beautiful but sharp-thorned leaves. At first, the difficult terrain appeared to be the primary obstacle. Edson lost only one man to a sniper during the initial landing. His plan was to move inland to a ridge that ran the length of the island and then advance along its crest, clearing the slopes as they moved south. However, the terrain was so challenging that it took 3 hours for the men to hack their way along 1.5 miles of rising ground. Having reached the ridgeline, the Marines moved forward, emerged from the jungle, and ran directly into the heart of the Japanese defenses, which were built into the hillside. The Japanese had constructed dugouts and rock embrasures, positioning their machine guns with care to create interlocking fields of fire. Their defensive strategy was based on holding the high ground and forcing the enemy to attack uphill. The Marines discovered that by crawling up the steep cliffs, they could drop dynamite charges and grenades into the dugouts. This became the primary method for advancing. Even after a dugout was blown, it was not necessarily safe. In one such position, the Americans killed 17 Japanese with dynamite. One Marine, spotting a radio inside, entered to retrieve it. 2 Japanese soldiers, still alive, shot him and another Marine who came to his aid before. They were finally killed. One section of Marines engaged this central defense position while the center and left flank of Edson's force pushed down the ridge. Even along the ridgeline, progress was difficult and costly. One company suffered 15% casualties that first afternoon. The frontal resistance was stiff, but with the Japanese, frontal resistance was only half the battle. Snipers seemed to be everywhere, tied in trees, perched on top of buildings, hidden behind rocks. A favorite sniper tactic was to allow the forward element of a Marine unit to pass, then open fire on the men from behind. This maneuver almost invariably resulted in the sniper's death, but not before he had inflicted several casualties. The first raiders also learned that day that the small .25 caliber Japanese rifle and machine gun slugs were more likely to wound than to kill immediately, a tactical consideration satisfactory from the Japanese perspective, as it forced the enemy to expend additional resources caring for the wounded. During the afternoon, the raiders drove along the ridge until they encountered a 3-sided ravine whose floor was an old British cricket field. The Japanese had dug into the walls of the ravine and established deadly fields of fire, a defensive pattern that would become grimly familiar to the Marines in the months to come. As the Marines advanced, they ran into a crossfire, and Edson halted the advance because darkness was approaching. This was no time to be probing unknown dangers in the fading light. That night, the Marines on Tulagi experienced another new and harrowing aspect of Japanese tactics, the desperate, death-defying counterattack for which they would become infamous. The Japanese, knowing they were outnumbered and had little chance of survival, waited until the Marine perimeter had grown quiet. Then, at 10:30 p.m., they launched a fierce assault, breaking through between 2 Marine companies and surrounding one of them. The Marines fought from their foxholes and in the open using rifles, machine guns, grenades, and knives. A group of Japanese charged along the ridge toward Colonel Edson's command post, reaching a point just 50 yards away before they were finally overpowered and thrown back. In the ferocious close-quarters fighting, one Marine company lost half of its non-commissioned officers. The next day, August 8th, more troops were landed on Tulagi, bringing the total American force on that side of Sealark Channel to about 7,500 men. Edson's raiders and men from the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, resumed their advance toward the southeastern end of the island. One by one, they assaulted the dug-in machine gun positions on the steep sides of the old cricket ground. From one cave alone, they removed 35 dead Japanese soldiers, some already rotting in the tropical heat, others killed in the final moments of defending the position. From this, the Americans correctly deduced the fundamental Japanese tactical principle: to hold a position until the last man, unless ordered to retreat, a stark demonstration of the discipline ingrained in the Japanese armed forces. Those Japanese who surrendered on Guadalcanal during these initial days were almost exclusively members of labor battalions, not combat troops. The raiders, on that second day, encountered dozens of examples of a fighting spirit they had never before witnessed. In one dugout, they cornered 3 Japanese officers who, at the end, possessed only one loaded pistol among them. As the Marines prepared for the final assault, they heard 3 shots from inside. When they entered the dugout, they discovered 3 bodies and an empty pistol. One officer had fired all but his last 3 rounds, then shot his 2 companions and finally himself. In those first days, this suicidal determination shocked the Americans. It was difficult for an American soldier to comprehend why cornered or wounded men, with no hope of survival, knowing the enemy held an overwhelming material and numerical advantage, would almost invariably choose death over surrender. It was a harsh reality that took some getting used to. But after a few instances where Japanese soldiers pretended to surrender only to pull out concealed weapons or explode grenades to kill both themselves and their captors, the Marines learned to take the Japanese on their own terms. Thereafter, there were virtually no further attempts to persuade Japanese soldiers to surrender. Tulagi was largely brought under American control on that second day, although not all Japanese defenders had been eliminated. For days afterward, Isolated Japanese snipers continued to harass American troops until each one was hunted down and killed. The stubborn, ferocious nature of the fighting on Tulagi is encapsulated in the experience of Gunnery Sergeant Angus Goss. He advanced ahead of his men to attack a cave near the cricket field from which the Japanese had been firing sporadically. Moving up close, he began throwing hand grenades into the cave opening. The Marines had been trained to pull the pin on the egg-shaped grenade, count slowly, and then throw. Sergeant Goss pulled the pin, counted to 6, and threw the grenade. It was immediately lobbed back out of the cave, forcing him to duck to escape the blast of his own weapon. After an identical experience with a second grenade, he held the next one for a count of 3, then threw 4, 5, 6, and out it came again. Frustrated and angered, Sergeant Goss called for a satchel charge, a bag filled with dynamite, typically used for demolishing buildings. He thrust the primed charge into the mouth of the cave and ran back. The Japanese managed to push the charge back out. It exploded, driving a rock splinter into Goss's leg. The wound was not serious enough to incapacitate him, but it was painful enough to infuriate him. He grabbed his submachine gun, charged directly into the cave, spraying fire, and killed 4 Japanese soldiers. Inside, he counted 8 others who had been killed earlier in the fighting. If possible, the fighting on the small connected islands of Gavutu and Tanambogo was even more intense and vicious than on Tulagi. The landings there commenced in the middle of the morning. Initially, not many troops were committed because intelligence suggested only a light enemy presence. However, since these islands housed the seaplane base, the Japanese had fortified them more heavily than anticipated, and the Marines immediately encountered serious trouble. The Japanese were surprised and had not fully recovered from the preliminary bombardment and aerial attacks that had destroyed their seaplanes, so the first wave of Marines was met primarily with rifle fire. But by the time the second wave approached the beach, the Japanese had organized a defense about 500 yards inland, and the fire became intense. The third wave came under heavy fire before their landing craft even reached the shore, sustaining heavy casualties. Both Gavutu and Tanambogo were dominated by small hills, neither quite 150 feet high, but this elevation was sufficient for defense. The Japanese had built their defensive positions along the slopes and were well supplied with machine guns, automatic rifles, and ample ammunition. As on Tulagi, each Japanese position had to be taken by direct assault. The defenders did not retreat. The viciousness of the close-quarters combat on Tanambogo was almost unbelievable. In the early waves, the Marines had landed a few light tanks. Japanese soldiers surged toward the Tanambogo dock where the landings were taking place. They jammed crowbars under the tank treads, threw grenades, and attempted to set the tanks on fire with gasoline-soaked rags. One tank commander opened his hatch to use the tank's machine gun and managed to kill 23 Japanese soldiers before one managed to scramble onto the tank and stab him to death with a bayonet. Another Japanese soldier then threw gasoline-soaked rags inside the tank, setting it ablaze. By mid-afternoon on the first day, it was apparent that the Marines on Gavutu Tanambogo needed reinforcements. A unit that had landed earlier on Florida Island, where no Japanese were present, was called over to assist. Tanambogo had been taken, but the Marines were unable to secure the causeway linking the 2 small islands. The reinforcements were ordered to land at Tanambogo. At dusk, they were given a mere 5 minutes of preparatory naval bombardment. Unfortunately, one of the final shells hit a fuel dump near the beach, igniting it and illuminating the shoreline as if it were broad daylight. As the Marines approached, they were perfectly silhouetted against the sea. From the dugouts on the hills, a steady stream of machine gun and rifle fire poured down. 2 boatloads of Marines managed to reach the beach, but the coxswain of the third boat was killed at his tiller. The boat slewed around and headed back out to sea. The following boats, witnessing this, assumed a change in orders and also turned back. This left the men from the first 2 boats stranded ashore with only a concrete pier for protection. As soon as the Americans returned fire, the Japanese spotted their positions by the tracer rounds. Several men were hit almost immediately. One boat retired, taking the wounded, and it was some time before the confusion was resolved and other boats began landing. Meanwhile, the Japanese launched a counterattack on the beach. The leader of the Marine unit, Captain Crane, was cut off from his boat. He and 5 men hid in the brush and, under cover of darkness, managed to escape and return to the beach after the Japanese had withdrawn to their hillside positions. They were eventually extracted, but it was not until 4 a.m. on August 8th that another unit landed and successfully secured the causeway. When the fighting began, there were approximately 500 Japanese troops on the connected islets of Gavutu and Tanambogo. When the fighting ended, there were none left alive. Early on the morning of August 7th, the radio station on Tulagi flashed the first word of the American assault to Rabaul. The astounding news reached the Rabaul airfield just as pilots were preparing for their daily missions against Australian forces on New Guinea. Those orders were immediately cancelled, and all available aircraft were dispatched to strike the American invasion force. Before these planes could take off, they received the unwelcome update from Tulagi that the entire flying boat flotilla had been destroyed. Then, radio contact with Tulagi was lost, a clear indication that the base had been overrun. At 8:30 a.m., a flight of 27 twin-engine Betty bombers took off from Rabaul. They had been loaded with bombs for the planned strike on New Guinea, not with the more effective torpedoes. 18 Zero fighters accompanied them as they climbed to 13,000 feet, flew east to Buka Island, and then turned south along the Bougainville coast. They were detected by 4 F-4F Wildcat fighters from the USS Enterprise just after 1 Oz p.m. The Enterprise fighters, flying at 18,000 feet, spotted the large formation of Betty bombers escorted by Zeros just above Florida Island. The F-4Fs attacked. Lieutenant V.P. Dietz shot down 1 bomber, and 4 others began to smoke and were listed as probables. But after this initial pass, the Zeros joined the fray, and the outnumbered F-4Fs broke off to take refuge in cloud cover as per their instructions. They had been hard hit. 1 F-4F was shot down, and Lieutenant Dietz's plane was so badly damaged he had to make an emergency landing on the USS Wasp. Lieutenant G.E. Firebaugh led another flight of 6 fighters from the Enterprise, and they encountered the enemy off Santa Isabel Island. 10 Zeros came in fast and attacked. 3 of the American fighters were shot down almost immediately. The remaining 3 F-4Fs attacked the bombers, and Ensign R.N. Driscoll shot down 1 Betty. The first kill of a Zero in this engagement was credited to radio electrician T.W. Rhodes. But the Zeros swarmed after them in force, and the surviving F-4Fs were forced to duck into clouds for protection. There were 10 Zeros pursuing them in 2 disciplined formations, attacking from the starboard quarter. Lieutenant Firebaugh, enlisted pilot W.S. Stevenson Jr., and pilot machinist W.H. Warden were all shot down. A coast watcher subsequently rescued Firebaugh from the water off Santa Isabel Island. Another Guadalcanal coast watcher sent a canoe to rescue Warden off the same island, but Stevenson was never found. Aboard the other American carriers, the story was much the same. The Japanese bombers proved to be easier targets. 6 fighters from Flight 323 encountered enemy bombers off Lunga Point and shot down 4 of them. Machinist D.P. Roonan destroyed 2 of these single-handedly. Just after 2:30 p.m., when the Japanese Betty bombers and Zero fighters began their attack run over the islands, the Allied coast watchers were on high alert. Paul Edward Mason, a former copra planter stationed on Malabita Hill on Bougainville overlooking Buka Passage, had sent a message at 9 a.m. that 24 Japanese bombers were heading toward Guadalcanal. They were still 400 miles away, over 2¼ hours from their target, when this message was relayed from Pearl Harbor to the fleet. This early warning reached the invasion fleet with plenty of time to prepare. The reaction aboard HMS Canberra, one of the Australian heavy cruisers, was typical. When the word came, the bosun's mate piped the message. The ship will be attacked at noon by 24 torpedo bombers. All hands will pipe to dinner at 1100, and the torpedo. Bombers arrived right on schedule. The American fighter planes climbed to 20,000 feet as the bombers approached the north shore of Guadalcanal and looked down upon the sprawling invasion fleet. At noon, both the American carrier fighters and the anti-aircraft guns of the warships were ready for them. For the first time in the South Pacific, the Japanese were feeling the full force of a coordinated counterattack. The American fighter planes proved highly effective against the twin-engine bombers. Of the 24 Bettys that finally reached Guadalcanal, all but 1 were shot down. The only significant damage sustained in this first major attack was to the destroyer USS Mugford, which was hit by a bomb. Against the agile Zero fighters, however, it was a different story entirely. Pilot Officer Saburo Sakai, Japan's leading ace at the time, was among the 18 elite pilots chosen for this first long-range mission. The Japanese force was jumped by F-4F Wildcats from the carriers, which went straight for the bombers, initially ignoring the Zeros. The Zeros did their best to protect the bombers, but then turned their attention to the American fighters. Sakai was puzzled by the American tactics. The Navy pilots dove against the Zeros, but if they missed on the first pass, they would scatter and evade, refusing to engage in a turning dogfight. They had been well instructed by their intelligence officers, who knew the Zero was superior in turning radius, climbing ability, and speed. After a grim and skillful battle, Sakai shot down one F-4F and an SBD Dauntless dive bomber that had audaciously attacked a formation of 4 Zeros by itself. Several other Japanese pilots also scored kills while 1 Zero was lost. Pilot Sakai himself then attacked a group of SBDs, mistakenly thinking they were fighters, and flew straight into the fire of their rear-facing machine guns. His Zero was badly damaged, and he was seriously wounded, yet displaying incredible skill and determination. He managed to fly his crippled plane all the way back to Rabaul and land it before collapsing. The Japanese still held a temporary advantage in the quality of the Zero fighter. But the Americans in their F-4F Wildcats were already beginning to learn how to exploit the enemy's limitations. The issue of air superiority was obviously going to be contested fiercely. At this particular moment, the Americans held the advantage of proximity, with their carriers operating close offshore. However, the Japanese held the advantage of numbers at Rabaul, and the American effort was seriously hampered by the Zero's superiority over the F-4F Wildcat, which was not as fast or as maneuverable. The Japanese pilots could, quite literally, fly rings around them. The one significant advantage of the F-4F was its sturdy construction and armor protection for the pilot, which often allowed it to absorb a tremendous amount of punishment and still return to its carrier. All that was needed to keep the loss ratio manageable was tactical discipline. At Rabaul, the Japanese recovered rapidly from the surprise of the American invasion, but the major problem for their fighter pilots was the immense 100-mile round trip to Guadalcanal. For this reason, on the first day, Commander Nakajima, the leader of the fighter squadron, had resisted demands from higher command to send all available Zeros, dispatching only his most experienced flyers. He would soon be forced to send others, and losses would mount, largely due to the vast distances involved. By nightfall on the first day, the United States invasion appeared secure. American troops on Guadalcanal had advanced to the edge of the airfield, which they would soon name Henderson Field in honor of Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at Midway and had encountered no substantial resistance. One prisoner was taken. He indicated that there were only about 600 combat troops on the island, along with 400 laborers, and that they had fled to the opposite side. Admiral Turner had successfully put 11,000 Marines ashore, and vast piles of ammunition, food, and other supplies crowded the beaches. General Vandergrift noted that the beach parties were unable to keep up with the influx of material, but fearing that the carriers would soon withdraw, he was glad to see the supplies continuing to arrive. He established a second beachhead, but it soon became as congested as the first. At 8:40 a.m. on the morning of August 8th, Coast Watcher Jack Red at Buka Passage spotted 45 Japanese dive bombers that had taken off from Kavieng 30 minutes earlier. Pearl Harbor relayed this warning to the fleet. Carrier planes intercepted and destroyed many of the enemy bombers, but on this day, the United States ships did not escape unscathed. One stricken bomber, blazing from anti-aircraft hits, plunged into the deck of the transport USS George F. Elliott, setting it on fire. Another dive bomber managed to launch a torpedo that struck the destroyer USS Jarvis, putting it out of action. That morning, planes from the Enterprise and the other carriers took off on their missions and found the skies relatively clear. They strafed and bombed Japanese troop concentrations along the Tenaru River and worked over the airfield once more. At about 10:01 a.m., 3 fighters from the Enterprise discovered a group of Japanese torpedo bombers coming in low over the water to attack the transports. The Americans pounced on them. Machinist Runin shot down 1 bomber and 1 fighter. Ensign V.H.H. Rouse shot down 2 twin-engine torpedo bombers. And Ensign J.D. Shoemaker shot down another. This effectively ended the significant air activity for the day. At nightfall, the Fighting 6 Squadron from the Enterprise counted its losses. 6 pilots shot down by Zeros. The Japanese Zero fighters still held an edge in both pilot experience and aircraft performance, but the American pilots were rapidly learning the tricks of their deadly trade. The commander of the Enterprise Air Group concluded that the Zero had 2 major weaknesses: limited firepower, its 20mm cannon had a low rate of fire and limited ammunition, and an inability to withstand punishment due to its lightweight construction and lack of pilot armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. Because of the Zero's superior rate of climb, maneuverability, and fuel capacity, the F-4F pilots were instructed to stick close together in their 2 plane elements. When attacked, each element was to set up a scissors movement, constantly turning toward each other. This tactic would allow the pair of F-4Fs to concentrate their superior firepower on any Zero that committed to an attack, while trusting that their own rugged planes could absorb a significant amount of enemy fire. On the ground, the Marines faced fierce Japanese opposition on Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo. On Tulagi, they suffered approximately 90 casualties, but secured control of the island by the end of the second day. The Japanese garrison of about 250 men fought virtually to the last man. 200 were killed, 3 surrendered, and the remainder swam the strait to Florida Island to continue resistance. On Gavutu and Tanambogo, the Marines suffered around 250 casualties. The 500-man Japanese garrison was annihilated to the last soldier. The ferocity of this fighting on the small island stood in sharp contrast to the relatively easy advance of the Marines on Guadalcanal. There, on the morning of August 8th, the Marines reached the edge of the airfield they would soon name Henderson Field. They were beginning to develop a certain contempt for the enemy. "I wish those Japanese would come out and fight," one Marine remarked within earshot of Richard Tregaskis, the International News Service correspondent who had accompanied the invasion. "All they do is run into the jungle." On the surface, the Marines couldn't ask for a finer war. But the more experienced officers felt a growing unease that second afternoon. It was all too easy. At sea, the Americans also seemed to face little opposition. A few Japanese patrol craft, tenders, and 1 or 2 small transports had been caught offshore and were destroyed in the first hours of the invasion by naval shelling and aerial bombing. Only in the air were the Japanese giving the Americans serious cause for concern. While most of the first waves of Japanese bombers were destroyed, the cost of engaging the agile Zeros was 21 of Admiral Fletcher's 99 carrier aircraft. This loss rate, while not exceptionally high by the brutal standards of aerial warfare, nevertheless reinforced Fletcher's conviction that his decision to withdraw was sound. At 6 p.m. that evening, Fletcher requested permission from Admiral Gormley to withdraw his carrier task force. He actually began withdrawing before he even received a reply. When Admiral Turner intercepted Fletcher's dispatch, he realized with dismay that the carrier withdrawal would leave his invasion fleet and the Marines ashore without vital air cover. He knew the number of Japanese aircraft attacking Guadalcanal could be expected to increase sharply as the enemy funneled more planes down the island chain from Rabaul. As Fletcher began his withdrawal, the Japanese were moving in force. When the word invasion had been flashed from Guadalcanal to Rabaul, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, commander of the Japanese 8th Fleet and the Outer South Seas Force, reacted immediately. His first move was to load 6 small transports with troops and dispatch them with a destroyer escort to reinforce the 2,000-man Guadalcanal garrison. However, this convoy was intercepted by the American submarine S-38, operating out of Australia since the fall of the Philippines. The S-38 torpedoed and sank the transport Mayo Maru, with the loss of 342 men. This sinking, coupled with reports of the enormous size of the American invasion flotilla, convinced Admiral Mikawa that it was too dangerous at that moment to attempt a reinforcement by slow transport. He recalled the other 5 transports. By that time, Japanese naval assistance was already en route to Guadalcanal. Admiral Mikawa benefited from fortunate timing. Early on the morning of August 7th, as the Tulagi garrison was sending its last desperate messages, 5 heavy cruisers had departed Cavayang on the northern tip of New Ireland. 3 were initially headed northeast toward Manus Island in the Admiralty Group, and 2 were bound for Rabaul. Admiral Mikawa soon ordered all 5 cruisers to hasten to Rabaul. Shortly after noon, the cruiser Chokai, accompanied by a destroyer, moved into Simpson Harbor at Rabaul. The other 4 cruisers waited in St. George's Channel between New Ireland and New Britain for the Chokai to rejoin them. When she came up late that afternoon, she was carrying Admiral Mikawa himself and was accompanied by the light cruisers Tenryu and Yubari. Thus, the Japanese task force speeding south toward Guadalcanal consisted of 5 heavy cruisers, Chokai, Aoba, Kako, Kinugasa, Furutaka, 2 light cruisers, Tenryu, Yubari, and 1 destroyer, Unagi. As they sped south, Admiral Mikawa composed his battle plan. By carefully regulating their speed, they could delay their arrival until after midnight on August 8-9 and launch a surprise night attack on the American forces concentrated at the beachhead. The admiral knew the Americans had several aircraft carriers in the area, while he had none. A night attack guaranteed that he would not be harassed by American carrier planes, as the Americans had no established record of proficiency in night aerial operations. In fact, the U.S. Navy had little experience in any form of night naval surface combat, an area in which the Japanese, with their superior optics, intensive training, and the deadly Type 93 long-lance torpedo, had developed a distinct specialty. Mikawa's problem that afternoon was how to approach Guadalcanal closely enough without arriving too soon, thus preserving the element of surprise. He needed to attack to support the Guadalcanal defenders, but if he could achieve complete surprise, the effectiveness of his strike would be magnified enormously. The admiral did not know it at that moment, but the nature of the divided American command, the inadequacies of the American aerial reconnaissance system, and the lack of clearly defined search patterns would all play directly into his hands. For intelligence regarding Japanese ship movements, the Americans at Guadalcanal had to depend primarily on aerial search and submarine reports. Only under the most exceptional circumstances would the reports of coast watchers be useful for tracking naval task forces. Early on August 7th, Mikawa's cruisers were sighted by United States Army B-17 bombers as they moved south toward Rabaul. On the evening of August 7th, the Mikawa force was sighted by the submarine S-38 just as it emerged from St. George's Channel. The commander of the S-38 reported the contact to Brisbane. However, these 2 reports were not given high credence by American naval commanders because Rabaul had become the Japanese Navy's major forward base, and ship movements in and out were considered routine. The Americans saw no specific indication that the ships sighted were steaming directly toward Guadalcanal. Admiral Gormley was responsible for coordinating all elements of the American operation, but to secure aerial searches, he had to depend on several independent and poorly coordinated sources. First were the long-range B-17 bombers of General MacArthur's U.S. Army Air Forces and the Australian Army Air Force, also part of MacArthur's command, which operated independently of naval control. Second was Admiral John S. McCain's land-based Naval Air Force, which included several seaplane tenders and PBY Catalina patrol bombers. General MacArthur's planes were assigned responsibility for searching the Bismarck Islands, concentrating on the major naval and air base at Rabaul. Admiral McCain's PBYs were tasked with watching the northern approaches to the region, meaning the Carolines and Marshalls. Admiral Fletcher's carrier planes were supposed to conduct short-range searches around the immediate invasion area, but in practice they conducted none at all. Fletcher was preoccupied with his own concerns about carrier vulnerability. Admiral Turner, studying his charts, had identified what he termed a marvelous approach for the Japanese to reach Guadalcanal. Along the west coast of Bougainville, straight down the channel between Choiseul and Vella La Vella, past Colombangara, between New Georgia and Santa Isabel, and then through the slot between Florida Island and the north coast of Guadalcanal. This waterway was soon christened the Slot, and it would become infamous in American naval history. The search plan for the morning of August 8th called for 4 PBYs to fly from Nandi on a 700-mile triangular pattern, whose apex was the Fiji Islands, far to the east of the Solomons. 6 PBYs would fly search patterns from Espiritu Santo to the northeast over the Santa Cruz Islands, ending at a point well to the west of the Japanese task force. Another 6 PBYs would spread out from Noumea to search an area north and west of the slot. 3 B-17s were to search north of Guadalcanal. On the night of August 7th, when Admiral Turner studied the search plan for the following day, he was alarmed to find that the slot itself was completely uncovered. He urgently requested that Admiral McCain order a special search of that critical area the next day. But somehow, in the chain of communication between Turner's flagship, McCain's headquarters, and the seaplane tender USS Mackinac at Noumea. The message was lost or misunderstood. The vital search of the slot was never flown. Thus, on August 8th, the Americans had left uncovered the most obvious and direct approach route for any enemy naval force intent on attacking Guadalcanal.